We are studying the book of Esther on Sunday mornings. This is a book that's set about 2,500 years ago in the Persian Empire, which was the most powerful empire in the world at that time. The Jewish people, the people of God, are living in exile in Persia. About 100 years before the events of this book that are recorded in this book, God's people, Israel, were forcibly removed from their homes in the Promised Land and taken to settle in what was then the Persian Empire. So last week we studied chapter 1, and we saw how the emperor of Persia, a man named Ahasuerus, deposed his queen Vashti because she disobeyed one of his royal commands. Today we look at chapter 2, and we're introduced to the woman who lends her name to the title of this book. We're introduced to Esther. I'll read Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, and we're going to look more closely at Mordecai, Lord willing, next week. The son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. This is God's word. So Esther 2 is a story all about how this young Jewish girl named Esther, living in exile in Persia, meets the emperor, King Ahasuerus. Now verse 16 tells us that Ahasuerus was in the 7th year of his reign. So we can date the events of chapter 2 with a great degree of accuracy. This is 479 BC, so roughly 2,500 years ago. Ahasuerus, we know from other sources, would have just returned from his disastrous war against the Greeks, which we can read about in the Greek historian Herodotus. And that war climaxed in the Battle of Salamis, where Ahasuerus' entire Persian navy was wiped out by the Greeks. So presumably, Ahasuerus returns to Susa, his citadel, in a foul mood. I mean, he's just lost a war. So his advisors encourage him, perhaps to cheer him up, to hold an international beauty pageant. And the winner of this pageant will be the new queen of the Persian Empire. So you've heard about American Idol. This is Persian Idol. Or, perhaps it's the inspiration for The Bachelor or something. I don't know. But the king's advisors appoint officers who are going to scour the empire for every single beautiful young woman. And actually, we might call them young girls because women typically married at age 13 or 14. So if you're going to find virgins, they're going to have to be younger than that. So thousands of these young girls are caught up in this dragnet and brought to Susa, and one of them is Esther. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah. Her Persian name is Esther. And Esther is chosen, of course, because she's a knockout. Verse 7 says she has a beautiful figure and is lovely to look at. Great face, great body. Esther and the others then spend a year getting ready for the king. We read in verse 12 that this was a regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with spices and ointments. And Josephus, who's the Jewish historian, tells us that from the thousands of women gathered for the first cut to meet the emperor, only 400 are actually taken to the next stage. And that's important to note because of how Ahasuerus would choose his queen. His choice would not be based only on how she looked. I mean, if that was the case, he could line up even, a couple of thousand women or 10,000 women, and in a day or two, pick the one that he thought was the best looking. Rather, each woman would spend one night with the king, and then he would make his decision. Yet even with the number winnowed down to 400, if you're going to give each woman one night, it's going to take a while. But eventually it becomes Esther's turn, and then we read in verse 17 that the king loved Esther more than all the women, and he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So that's Esther chapter 2. What in the world can we learn from this? And what I want to do is make 2 claims about God from Esther chapter 2. The first claim is that God is at work, even when he seems most absent. And the second claim is that God is ready to show grace, even when it seems most like that we've abandoned him. God is at work, even when he seems most absent, and God is ready to show grace, even when it seems most like we've abandoned him. So first, he's at work even when he seems absent. Esther becomes the queen of Persia, but do not think that means she became Ahasuerus' wife in any way anybody in this room would recognize. She is the queen, but at the end of the day, she's still just a part of the harem. She's still just one in a collection of many women Ahasuerus had accumulated for himself. They aren't living together as husband and wife because we read in chapter 4 that Esther can't even go and see Ahasuerus unless he first sends for her and gives permission. So she's the queen, but at the end of the day, she's just another member of the harem. Now, what was the harem of an ancient monarch in the Middle East like? Well, we actually don't know a lot about what the harem of a Persian emperor was like, but we do know a lot about what the harem of an Ottoman sultan was like. The Ottoman Empire was one of the great empires in the world for almost 1,000 years. And the harem of the sultan existed until just a little over 100 years ago. And even though there's, 1,500 years difference between the Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, not that much changed in world history, and not much changed between male and female relations between the Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. So we can read about that harem and draw a lot of conclusions about what the Persian harem would have been like as well. One source I read last week said this about the harem. Quote, "The Arabic word harem means forbidden. And the Sultan's harem was forbidden to all but the Sultan himself, his guests, the women who lived there, and the eunuchs who guarded them. It could be approached only by passing down a single passage through 4 locked doors. Each door was guarded day and night by eunuchs. Those are sexually altered men. And because they're sexually altered, they can be trusted around the king's women. Guarded by eunuchs who kept the only keys. Once a virgin passed through the harem doors, she remained there for life. There were no exceptions. On entering the harem, usually at the age of 10 or 11, a girl was rigorously schooled in feminine charm by experienced older women. Fully trained, the hopeful girls awaited the moment of preliminary approval when the Sultan tossed a handkerchief at her feet and she became, quote, in the eye. And there's an Arabic word for that. Not every girl who caught the Sultan's attention reached the supreme moment when she was summoned and became Iqbal, or bedded. But those who did received their own apartments, servants, jewels, dresses, and an allowance. As all the women in the harem were totally dependent on how well the Sultan was pleased, all were eager for opportunities to reach his bed, and once in it, desperate to please. Within the harem, as with everywhere in his empire, the Sultan was treated as a demigod. No woman was allowed to meet him unsummoned. Now you can see how the similarities between how the harem is described in Esther chapter 2 and what we read from Ottoman sources. But here's the point. Please don't make the mistake of thinking the book of Esther is a love story. You'll watch some cheesy Christian movies that act like, Ahasuerus and Esther fell in love. This isn't a love story. This is a lust story. This is the story of how an emperor's lusts are satisfied. Esther's a beautiful girl. She's already lost both of her parents. Thankfully, she has her cousin Mordecai, who's older, who can raise her. But then the king's men come and take her away, even from Mordecai. And she goes into this palace, and for a year she is pampered and primped. But then these older women come along and start telling her things about how to make men happy that at first her mind can't even process. And then after a year of this kind of training, she has her one night with the king, but this night does not involve dinner and a movie. And there are no chaperones. Now we read that, and immediately, at least in my mind, I go to these women, these young ladies that I love, that I care about, and it breaks our hearts. And, we want to say, where was God in all this? How in the world could God allow any of his people to go through that? Where was God? Do you want to know where God was in Esther chapter 2? He's where he always is. He's on his throne. God seems totally absent, yet God is still at work. Centuries earlier, God made a promise to a man named Abraham. We read about it in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 2, where God says, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And Esther and all the Jews in exile in Persia are descendants of that man. They are heirs of that promise. But as we'll see next week, Lord willing, there's a man who is so consumed by pride and hatred that he is determined to trick Ahasuerus into killing every single one of those heirs of the promise, all the Jewish people in Persia. But then God raises up Esther, and he brings her into the harem and through the harem to become the queen so that she would be in the right position at the right time to deliver God's people from the hands of their enemies. And that's the whole point of the book of Esther. Just when it seems like the promise is going to fail and God's people will be exterminated, God has Esther in the right place at the right time as the savior of her people. So yes, we read what Esther and these young women endured, and it grieves us, and it should grieve us. But when you're reading stuff like this in the Bible, you've got to know a couple of things. And the first thing you've got to know is God does not condone this kind of behavior. He does not condone sexual exploitation. God's pattern for sex has always been, this is in Genesis chapter 2, very beginning of the Bible. His pattern has always been for it to be expressed only inside of a loving covenant relationship between one man and one woman. But when you read the Bible, you see that almost as soon as sin enters the world, you've got men whose appetites are running away with them. And as they are able, they collect as many wives for themselves as they can to express this appetite. And then if you're the emperor, you have a harem. There is no other appetite that gets as obsessive as this one. You know, say you were visiting a country where when the young men go off to college, you notice that they put these posters up on the walls of their dorm rooms. And it's posters their moms would never let them have up on their rooms at home. And on these posters are pictures of hamburgers and hot dogs. And the boys are running from room to room, just drooling, looking at the hot dogs and the hamburgers on each other's walls. Or say you visit this country and you notice that the men go into darkened rooms and they pull out their cell phone and they're looking at illicit websites with videos in darkened rooms, and they're looking at the videos of pies being made. And they just, their heart rate goes up. They can't handle it. So many pies on these videos. You would think you were going to a country where everybody's starving, right? But they aren't starving. In fact, the more they eat, the less satisfied they get. They cannot quench this appetite. It's completely out of control. And God does not condone it. And more than that, God is not responsible. He is not morally responsible for it. The evil that we do is not God's fault. But God does arrange it. He is sovereign. He arranges it. He uses it. He controls it to bring about His good purposes in the world. And He's working through Esther. Even when it seems He's absent, He's working through Esther to bring about the salvation of His people. And still you may think, but JD, why does it have to be that way? I just can't get past Esther. Why does she have to be in Persia in the first place? Why didn't God just prevent the exile of the Jews? Why didn't He fix everything long before so that Esther was never in this position to have to go into the harem in the first place? Okay, let's think about that for a second. Don't you know the whole reason that Esther's in Persia in the first place is because her ancestors were among those Jews who oppressed, they were the powerful people in their land who oppressed the poor and committed sexual immorality and worshiped the false gods of other nations? They were bad, bad people. And so God could have either left them there in the promised land and continue on their path of hurtful behavior for others and more deeply ingrained sin, or He could have disciplined them by bringing them into Persia in exile. And if you're still thinking, but JD, I can't get past it. Why didn't God protect Esther? You might also want to consider thinking this. Why didn't God protect Jesus? Because Jesus is the only truly innocent sufferer this world has ever seen. No, He wasn't taken into the king's harem, but He was tried before a king and sentenced to death for blasphemy because He claimed to be the Son of God. But it wasn't blasphemy because He is the Son of God. You have Jesus Christ, fully God and fully man, walking on this planet for 33 years, living a life of perfect obedience, never once committing a sin. And then on the cross, dying the death reserved for wicked people. And Isaiah 53:7 says, He was oppressed and He was afflicted, yet He opened not His mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so He opened not His mouth. He gets railroaded in this farce of a trial. He doesn't say a word in his defense. In fact, he doesn't really open his mouth until he gets to the cross, and he cries out in despair, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So Jesus, he's the only innocent sufferer the world's ever known, and he's crying out to his Father, asking, why? Why is this happening? And what does heaven respond? Heaven says nothing. God seems totally absent. But you and I know, as Christians, on this side of the resurrection, that God is working even when he's absent. Because by Jesus Christ's perfect life and by his sacrificial death, he was bringing about the salvation of all his people. God seemed absent, but he was working. And that's one of the claims I want you to believe about God from the book of Esther. Now, second, God is ready to show grace even when we seem to abandon him. You know, the one thing we're not told anywhere in the book of Esther is what did Esther think about what was happening to her? We're given no insight into her inner world. Was she terrified when she was brought into the harem? I mean, we can speculate, but we don't know. The author does not tell us. But we do know one thing about Esther. She did not resist what was happening to her. She was compliant the whole time. And it begins with her name. Her Hebrew name, Hadassah, is mentioned only once. The rest of the time, she is Esther. And that is almost certainly a derivative from the word Ishtar, which was the Persian goddess of love. We might know her better as Venus in the West. Under instruction from her cousin Mordecai, she hides her Jewish identity and so completely identifies with this pagan culture around her that they don't even know who she is. They don't even know what her real name is. She's just Ishtar. Then, what she's taken into the harem, she does whatever those in charge say to do. You know, whatever food's put before her, she eats it. Whether or not it contradicts what the law of Moses says, whether or not it's kosher food, she's eating this food, and it almost certainly isn't kosher. It does violate the law of God. Now, contrast Esther's behavior with the behavior of another exile we read about in the Bible. His Babylonian name was Belteshazzar, but we know him better as Daniel. Esther eats whatever is put in front of her, but Daniel refuses to eat anything that could possibly break the law of Moses. Esther hides her Jewish identity. Daniel's very upfront and brazen about who he is. And then finally, when Esther does go in for her one night with the king, I don't know how else to put it, but she's in it to win it. We read in verse 13 that she could take, quote, whatever she desired when she spent the night with the king. Now, that's kind of a vague and uncertain phrase in Hebrew, but from the context, we can be reasonably assured that Esther was not walking into a night with a king with her favorite stuffed animal. Probably it refers to aphrodisiacs or some other material that would enhance the king's pleasure. And of course, it is her performance out of all the other hundreds of women that pleases the king most of all. Esther is not repelled by the thought of sleeping with the pagan king. In fact, she goes for it. And commentators, both ancient and modern, have hammered Esther for her behavior. One 15th century rabbi wrote this, quote, "Now when Mordecai heard the king's herald announcing that whoever had a daughter or a sister should bring her to the king and have relations with an uncircumcised heathen, why did he not risk his life to take her to some deserted place to hide until the danger would pass? He should have been killed rather than submit to such an act. And she, Esther, also should, by right, have tried to commit suicide before allowing herself to spend a night with the king." Okay, so the Jews just assault Esther for how she behaved, some of the Jewish commentators. But in modern times, you have feminist readings of the book of Esther. Did you know that there are feminist commentaries on the book of Esther? I didn't. But I read some of them this past week. And basically their message is, Vashti, she resisted the patriarchy. She stood up and didn't do what the men wanted her to do. But Esther, she just plays the Barbie doll, the sex kitten. She's happily doing whatever the men in charge tell her to do. You know, ancient Jewish rabbis and modern American feminists don't usually agree on much. But they all agree that Esther was a sellout. Now again, we're not told Esther's state of mind, so we're not in a position to judge what she did, and I don't think those rabbis or those feminists are in a position to judge what Esther did. But we can be clear that she did not resist the way other exiles in the Old Testament did. Esther 2 paints a picture of a young woman who has abandoned any pretense of following God. Yet, as we will see in the next 2 weeks in this series, God still uses Esther. We must not miss the fact that her history of compromise does not disqualify her from an opportunity for later obedience. And it's her later obedience that will prove to be the salvation of her people. You know, I'm sure in a room this size, we've got plenty of people who feel guilty over the compromises we've made with the world in our past. You know, we've all of us at one time or the other sold out our principles. You know, maybe it was with a sexual relationship. Maybe it was over money or career advancement. Or maybe it was simply, turning our back on a friend who was in need because of just too much trouble. Okay, we've all sold out our principles. But our God, Esther tells us, is sovereign even over our bad choices and missed opportunities, and you can be certain that you were brought to where you are right now today so that you can serve the Lord in a way no one else can because of your past. You are uniquely qualified to serve the Lord today. And that includes the past that brought you here and all the bad choices and missed opportunities. Where there is sin, grace from Jesus Christ is all the greater. And as one commentator put it, quote, that doesn't make the wrong decisions and sinful actions right, but it should cause us to give thanks to God that He is able to form beautiful pictures out of our smudged and stained efforts. Past failures do not write us out of God's script for the future. There's a rather famous story, sermon illustration told along these lines. I'm sure some of you have heard it before. There was a pastor who, before he became a pastor and he was a freshman in college, befriended a young woman in his art class. And he was 18 at the time, and she was 26, and she had a past. She was unmarried, but she had a child, and she was at that point in a relationship with another man who was married. So she was in a relationship with a married man. But this college student befriended her and started talking to her about Jesus. And she was very, standoffish at first because she'd been judged. This was in the South. She'd been around church people. She'd heard what they'd said about people who'd made decisions like she'd made. And so she was very standoffish. But gradually, his friendship won her over. And so he finally said, I'm going to invite her to something. So he had a friend of his playing in a worship band. And this band was going to provide the music at this big collegiate conference for 1,000 college students in the state. So he invites this woman to come along with him, but he made a mistake. He didn't ask who the speaker was going to be. Christians don't ever invite a non-Christian friend to an event unless you are absolutely sure who the Christian speaker is going to be. The guy gets up after the music, and he says, "Today I want to talk to you about sex." And the college freshman said, "Uh-oh, this may not be good." And it wasn't. This speaker started off his talk by holding up a rose. And he was talking about how beautiful it was. He was smelling it, and he's saying, "You've just got to see how beautiful this rose is." And so he threw it out in the crowd, and he said, everybody touch the rose, smell the rose. I want you to see how wonderful this rose is. And then he goes into his talk, and it's one of those fear-mongering talks about the dangers of sexual activity, kind of like, you don't want to have an STD, do you? Well, then don't have sex. You don't want to get pregnant when you're 18, do you? Well, then don't have sex. I'm about the same age as this pastor. I remember these kind of talks from that point in time. At this stage during the talk, this future pastor is getting angrier and angrier, and his friend, this woman, is slinking lower and lower into her chair, just feeling more and more shame at what she's hearing. And after 30 minutes, the speaker said, "Hey, where's my rose? Where's my rose?" And somebody, brings the rose back on stage, and of course, it's all broken. All the petals are gone, all the leaves are gone, the stem is damaged at 2 or 3 points. And the big climax of this guy's talk was to hold up what was left of the rose and say, "Now, who would want this?" As if to say, if you've ever made a mistake in your past, no one's ever going to love you. But this future pastor said that all he could think when he heard that speaker say, "Who would want this?" is, Jesus would. Jesus wants the rose. I mean, that is the gospel after all. Jesus did not come for perfect people. Jesus only came for people with a past. Everybody has a past. Some of our pasts are more open and out there than others, but everybody has a past. Jesus did not come to save the well. He came for the sick. He is the great physician. If you don't think you have any problems, Jesus is no help to you. No help to you. You can get up and walk out right now if you don't think you have any problems. Jesus came for the sick, for the broken, for those with the past, for those who have compromised with the world repeatedly and feel terrible about it. And it's to those people that Jesus says through the prophet Isaiah, chapter 1, verse 18, "Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow." The whole point of the book of Esther is that your past sins and mistakes, your compromises with the world, do not have to define you. Rather, you can this day begin your journey down the road of grace. We're about to take the Lord's Supper, and we invite all who confess their sins and place their trust in Jesus Christ to participate. And I say that to you regardless of your church membership, regardless of your baptism status, and even if you started believing in the gospel during this sermon, come and welcome to the Lord's table. And let's be clear, okay? I don't want there to be any doubt about this before we serve the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is not for perfect people. If you're perfect, don't take it. The Lord's Supper is for broken people. One of my favorite stories about the Lord's Supper is about this minister serving in a small church in Scotland where the minister would actually come to you and give you the bread and the cup. And he noticed on a communion Sunday there was a young girl sobbing in her pew. And so he went to her with the bread and the cup. And at first she turned her face away, but he just leaned over and said, "Take it. Take it. It's for sinners." And that's what I tell you all today too. Take it. Take it. It's for sinners. Amen. Let's pray together.